Welcome to U.S. History 2202, Section 10. This is Week 3, The Transformation of the American West. And this is Lecture 3, The Fall and Rise of the American Indian and Diversity in the American West. What you just saw was a collection of images and film footage. I'm particularly to know the two film clips at the very beginning of this particular presentation. The first one is from 1890, and it is the first depiction that we know of Native Americans captured on film. It was captured by Thomas Edison's breakthrough, pioneering film technology of the time. But the second film clip is more interesting in a way. It's a depiction of what was called the ghost dance. And we're going to talk about the ghost dance. It had a significant role in the final years of sort of Indian resistance to white intrusions onto their land in the West. And we'll get to that towards the end of today's discussion. To recap what we've been talking about in the last two lectures, we were focusing mostly on land. We were focusing on the expropriation of Indian land by whites through the use of the U.S. By means of the U.S. government and the military, essentially military solutions to the problem that the American government was trying to address, and that is to take away the lands that belong to the Indian and give them over to homesteaders, as well as corporations and railroads and others that wanted to exploit the resources of the Trans-Mississippi West. This military solution resulted in numerous massacres of Native Americans, numerous battles between Native Americans and white troops. But battles and massacres, like the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, were occasional events. They didn't happen every day. What was probably more destructive of the Native Americans' place in the Trans-Mississippi West was the general policies of the U.S. government to alienate Indians from their land by other means, by means that were not as forceful as military engagements, as massacres like the one at Wounded Knee, and so forth. And so we're going to take a look at some of those overall policies and methods by which the U.S. government, backed by settlers, and the U.S. government, of course, backing settlers, in alienating Indians from the lands of the Trans-Mississippi West. One method was to destroy the Indians, the Native Americans of the Great Plains' ability to survive on the Great Plains. One of the strategies to that end was to destroy their main source of food, shelter, and clothing, and that, of course, is the bison, or the buffalo, as they were mistakenly called. Now, some buffalo were hunted for sport, some buffalo were hunted for meat to provide food for railroad crews and others, but for the most part, the massacre of the buffaloes, the destruction of the buffaloes, was a concerted, systematic, and deliberate policy of the United States government, as well as settler groups, to destroy the buffalo, or the bison, of the Great Plains. One goal, of course, was to eliminate this animal competitor to the herds of cattle that Americans ranchers wanted to graze on the thick, rich grasses of the Great Plains. But of course, authorities, government officials, and others recognized that by destroying the buffalo, they would destroy the ability of Native Americans to survive on the Great Plains. This quote from the Secretary of the Interior, Columbus Delano, in 1874, captures that sentiment. The buffalo are disappearing rapidly, but not faster than I desire. I regard the destruction of such game as Indians subsist upon as facilitating the policy of the government of destroying their hunting habits, coercing them on reservations, and compelling them to begin to adopt the habits of civilization. At the very beginning of our discussions this week about the Trans-Mississippi West and the American Indian, I used the word genocide. Now, the term genocide means the deliberate destruction of a people, but it doesn't always necessarily mean the actual physical destruction of the people. In 1948, in the wake of World War II, and in the wake, of course, of revelations about the Jewish Holocaust by the Nazis, the United Nations basically wrote up what they called the Convention on Genocide in order to determine what would constitute a crime against humanity. And in this UN Convention on Genocide, written up in 1948, the authors of the convention wrote that any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And if we look down to clause C, it says deliberately afflicting upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. In fact, the destruction of the bisons of the Great Plains was a deliberate infliction on the group of conditions that would hamper their ability to survive. So by the UN Convention on Genocide, which of course still holds to this day, is still international law, what the United States government did in its concerted and deliberate efforts to eliminate the bison from the Great Plains was an act of genocide. We'll get to. If we continue our examination of the UN Convention on Genocide, let us scroll down to Clause E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In fact, the two documents that were on the website that I had you read deal with this issue of transferring children of the group. In this particular case, it was the transferring of children of Native American families to these boarding schools that the government set up, where the students were basically forced to give up the knowledge and ways and practices and customs and beliefs of their own culture and learn and be indoctrinated into the beliefs, ideas, and practices of white American civilization. One of the documents I had you read, of course, was the memoirs of Zitkala Sa, also known as Gertrude Bond, and that was her English name. Now, Zitkala Sa was a member of the Dakota Sioux, and like thousands of other Native American children, she was removed from her family and community in the late 1800s and sent to a boarding school paid for by the government but administered by a church, in her case the Quakers. The idea was that by removing children from their homes, authorities hoped to remove them from Indian cultural influences and reshape them in the image of white America. The process could be quite traumatic for the children, as well as for their families, as this excerpt from Zitkala Sa's memoirs make clear. Now, in fact, many Native American parents and families were not opposed to schools per se, to white schools per se. They understood that their world was changing, that white American civilization was increasingly encroaching upon their lands and upon their lives. And they recognized the value that their children would get in English education in the English language, and some of the ways and practices of of the white man so that they could survive in this new world that was coming rapidly down upon them. But what they oftentimes opposed was this idea of boarding schools, the idea of removing the children from the families and placing them hundreds of miles away, and in the case of the Carlisle School, which was located in Pennsylvania, thousands of miles away from where their families, communities, and tribes were. But of course, from the white man's perspective, from those who advocated boarding schools for Indian children, that was exactly the point. The point was to take the children away from those influences that they saw as negative, as holding these children back, as inculcating them in savage ways, that it was very important to remove them from the family, remove them from their communities, and remove them from their tribal influences. And of course, one of the ways they did that was by not only removing them from their tribes, but also stripping them of any kind of cultural customs that they had. In the reading I gave you for this week, that had to do with cutting of Zitkala's hair, long hair. Of course, in the Dakota Sioux culture, long hair was not just something of pride, but it was also considered part of one's cultural identity. It was considered a source of strength, a source of power. It was a literal outgrowth of one's spirit in the long hair that women and men, young boys, also had. And here she describes experience. In spite of myself, she was resisting this as she went into the boarding school. One of the first things they did when these children would arrive at the boarding school was, of course, to strip them of their cultural customs. So they were forced to take off whatever kind of Indian clothes they had. They were forced to put on white man's clothes. They were not allowed to speak their own language. They were not allowed to practice dances or any kind of other rituals. Sometimes they would go off in the night and sneak away and try to do them. But again, they were young children. They were highly impressionable. They followed what they were told to do, and which is exactly what those who organized these schools and ran these schools and taught these schools wanted. They understood that children are more impressionable, that adults is very difficult to reprogram, as it were, adults into white American culture. But children are more malleable, they're more impressionable, they follow orders, they're more obedient. And so the idea was, if you can get the children into these schools, then you can slowly wean them away from Indian civilization and inculcate them with white values. And of course, cutting of the hair was a big part of that. And she describes her experience, which even across these years comes across as quite traumatic for her. I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck and heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit. Since the day I was taken from my mother, I had suffered extreme indignities. People had stared at me. I had been tossed about in the air like a wooden puppet, and now my long hair was shingled like a coward's. So from her perspective, this was a traumatic stripping away of her cultural identity, which in a sense is what the organizer of these schools wanted to achieve. And in fact, since that 1948 UN Convention on Genocide was written, other ideas about genocide have also emerged. And one of those ideas about genocide is not just the physical destruction of a people, but also their stripping them away of their culture. So in a sense, a kind of cultural genocide. That is, by taking away their how they identify as a distinct ethnic group and inculcating them with the values of the dominant ethnic group. So in that sense, this whole this process of taking children from Native American families and inculcating white values was a form of cultural genocide. And this idea leads to the second reading that I had you do this week, and that is Captain Richard Pratt. Richard Pratt's speech, written down here, a note called "Kill the Indian and Save the Man," on the assimilation of Native Americans. The speech was given in 1892. Now, Pratt begins his speech by talking about a great general, Union Civil War general, Philip Sheridan specifically, has that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. He writes down the second paragraph, "It is a sad day for the Indian when they fall under the assault of our troops, as in the Piegan massacre, the massacre of Old Black Kettle and his Cheyennes, and what is termed the Battle of the Washita, and hundreds of others like places in the history of our dealings with them." In saying this, Pratt acknowledges the terrible physical destruction that Native Americans faced at the hands of white men and at the hands of American troops. Interestingly, going to the theme of diversity in the American West, a number of the regiments that patrolled the American West and were there to place Indians on reservations, remove them from the lands, were actually regiments of freed persons. They were known. There were a couple of these regiments out west. They were known. They were known popularly as Buffalo Soldiers. That was the name that Native Americans gave to them. And the whole thing of African American troops being used to pacify and control Native Americans is sort of a sad sub-story of the American West, that one oppressed group would be used by the United States government to oppress another group. But anyways, getting back to Pratt's speech here, you'll note that he's not approving of these kinds of massacres. He says they're quite awful. And in fact, there were this kind of highlights the two approaches that Americans had towards the Native Americans of the Trans-Mississippi West after the Civil War, and what was to be done about them. One group, one side of this argument was represented by Philip Sheridan. Basically, that the Native American was doomed to fade away, literally fade away, to disappear as a people, physically to disappear as a people, for that population to just simply go away. And one of the arguments made was based on that social Darwinist thinking that we talked about before, and that was the idea that, there were races of people that were superior to others. The white man was superior to the Indian. The Indian was not capable in the great struggle for survival of the world, for the survival of the species of man, that eventually the superior race would eventually displace the inferior race. So these Darwinist ideas oftentimes informed U.S. policy in the West, and people like Philip Sheridan, who saw that it was inevitable that the Indian was going to die out because he was simply an inferior specimen of humanity, and he must give way to the superior specimen of humanity, the white man, in the struggle for survival that was simply part of nature, as Darwin had argued. Of course, Darwin himself would have never applied his theories to human society in this way. But notably, what Pratt says here is that, in a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. In other words, Pratt is not for the outright genocide of the Native Americans. He doesn't want to massacre them, as some government and army officials wanted to do. No, instead, what he believed was that you had to, as he says, kill the Indian and save the man. In other words, take away the Indian culture and reshape the Indian in the image of the white man for him to survive. In fact, he says in the second paragraph of his speech here, actually it's not the second paragraph, the second paragraph of the excerpt that I'm reprinting here, he says that, these massacres are terrible, and he doesn't support them in any kind of way. But he says it's far sadder, is it, for them to fall, when they fall under the baneful influences of a treaty agreement with the United States, whereby they are to receive large annuities and to be protected on reservations and held apart from all association with the best of our, that is, white American civilization. The destruction is not so speedy, but it is far more general. So what is he saying here? What he's saying here, basically, is that it's a worse fate for the Indian to fall into, to be placed on these reservations, to get welfare from the government, partly because the reservations could not support them and they needed something to keep them alive, and that it would be far better for them, and it was wrong for them to be kept away from the wonderful influences of white civilized society and white civilized culture, that by placing them apart on these reservations, you were dooming them, in a sense, to a destruction, that they would eventually fade away in the Darwinian struggle for survival, not so much by just simply killing them off, but because their culture was inferior and they would not be able to survive. And so he sees himself as a noble humanitarian trying to save the Indian, trying to save the actual physical Indian, the population of Indians, by by completely assimilating them into American culture, getting rid of what is Indian in them, and replacing that with what is valued by white civilization. And by that, he meant a number of things. He meant, sort of farming on the land rather than hunting. It meant individual ownership of property rather than communal ownership of property that the Indians practiced. It meant, of course, adoption of the Christian religion. It meant adoption of all the ways of civilization that he thought were superior to how the Indians lived. And he continues, we have never made any attempt to civilize them with the idea of taking them into the nation, and all of our policies have been against citizenizing them and absorbing them. What he's saying here, basically, is that he's taking to task his fellow Americans, his fellow white Americans, the government, the military, and other officials, by saying, we've been practicing policies that discourage assimilation. Now, as we go down here, he says, although some of the policies now prominent are advertised to carry them into citizenship and consequent association and competition with other masses of the nation, they are not in reality calculated to do this. We are after the facts, he says. Let us take the land in severalty. Now, the Land in Severalty Bill was a federal law from 1887, 5 years before he gave this speech. It's popularly known as the Dawes Act after one of its authors in Congress. And what the Dawes Act basically did was it took the lands that had been given to the Indians as reservations, and it forced the Native American peoples to divide up those lands and to give over to each Indian family, or each individual adult, if they didn't have a family, a piece of that land, of that reservation. And the idea, of course, was to get rid of the old communal ideas of land ownership that the Indians had, or not so much ownership, but that the land was collectively belonged to the entire tribe, and give it to individual families so that they could settle down, farm, develop their property, and follow the paths of the white man, economically speaking, and also culturally speaking, so that they would become more like the white man, settled on his own land, with his own family, in his own home, and that sort of thing. But what he notes is that while he supports this policy in theory, in fact, what was oftentimes happening was that the allotments, he says, were actually being, what the Indians were doing was they were trying to subvert the purpose of the law by entering into a compact amongst themselves to continue to hold their lands in common as a reservation. What he doesn't talk about is that the Dawes Act also led to further alienation of the Indians from their land, even as individual land. Unscrupulous real estate developers and other whites were able to manipulate the Indians because, again, the Native American peoples of the plains did not have a tradition. They did not have it was not part of their culture to think of individual land and ownership of the land in absolute terms the way the white man did, that it was their property to transfer as they wished or whatever. And so oftentimes unscrupulous real estate speculators and others would offer the Indians various enticements of material goods, oftentimes food and supplies that some of these Indian families desperately need, because many of the Indian families that were given these lands on the plains had grown up in a hunting tradition and really didn't know how to properly farm, and so they were going hungry, and so these real estate speculators and others would entice them with supplies and food that they desperately needed for their families, and in exchange would sell their lands to white men. But what Pratt is more worried about is that the Indians are subverting the Dawes Act, or the Severalty Bill, by sort of making these compacts with each other to share the land as they had it in a traditional ways. So again, the whole point of this was to, as he says, kill the Indian and save the man, to eliminate this cultural practice of communal land ownership and give it and perpetuate their old culture, which Pratt believes is inferior to the white man's idea of individual property. He also criticizes those Indian schools like the ones that Kalasaw went to, including the Carlisle school. He mentions Indians in Catholic schools, and the point there, he says, is that this is not good, that we're placing the Indians in these separate schools where they are more likely not only to retain their own culture, but not to be exposed to this superior white American culture that they would get if they went to public schools. And in fact, by the way, this is kind of related to what was also going on in eastern cities with immigrants. Many of the immigrants pouring into the United States in this same period were Catholic in background, and a lot of times they would attend Catholic schools, and there was a lot of hostility among white native-born Protestant Americans that Catholicism did not suit the American scene, that Catholicism was this alien religious ideology that emphasized values that were not democratic. You listen to your priest and you listen to the Pope, you followed their orders. And there was this idea that Catholicism didn't fit the American way of life. And so even as Pratt is talking about how these Catholic schools keep the Indians apart from the white man, there was also and that the Indians should be in public schools where they'd be exposed to proper white Protestant culture. This was also being argued about. This was also one of the impetuses behind the public school movement of the late 19th century in urban areas of the East, was so that immigrants wouldn't be going to these Catholic schools where they'd be learning values that white American Protestants thought were hostile and not appropriate for American civilization, white American Protestant civilization. And here, in fact, we see the actual legislation, the Dawes Act, and as it said, it was basically designed, set up a system by which the government would survey the lands of the reservation, then break it up into pieces, and to each of the head of the family would be given 1/4 of a section, to each person over 18 years of age, 1/8 of a section. And as I mentioned before, a couple of problems with this. One was that many of the reservations were on very substandard land. This was land that the white men did not want. And the reason why the white men did not want it oftentimes was that it wasn't suitable for farming or even sometimes for ranching. And so the lands broken up, the only way the Native Americans could survive on the land was through their traditional communal ways of hunting. But of course we saw that the bison had been largely eliminated, so that wasn't an option. And living on these small plots of land was just not possible. You couldn't survive because the land just did not suit. There wasn't enough water or whatever to be suitable for farming. In addition to that, as I mentioned before, many of the Native Americans did not come from farming traditions. They didn't know, they really didn't understand how farming went. And for them, farming was this alien culture. It would be sort of like asking, Americans of white Americans of the 19th century who were used to farming to go out and try to survive on the plains by hunting. They wouldn't be able to do it. They wouldn't want to do it. They wouldn't know how to do it. They would see it as alien, and they would be. It would be something that they did not want to do. And so in turn, so if we sort of turn things on its head, that's exactly how the Native Americans felt. And so by the end of the 1880s, the Native American was under assault in a variety of ways, the Native American of the Trans-Mississippi West. There was the constant massacres. There was the removal off their native lands to reservations. There was the Dawes Act, which was trying to break up communal land ownership and basically to break up the very idea of the tribe and turn Native Americans into individualistic Americans. There was, of course, the schools where Native American children were removed from their families and indoctrinated into white culture. And in the face of this multifaceted assault on their way of life, there arose a kind of counter movement. And it began with this guy. You can see him here on the left. His name was Wovoka. His English name was Wilson. And he was a Paiute Indian from Nevada. And he was also a shaman or a medicine man among his people, a man who had connections to the spiritual world. And in 1889, he had a vision. He had a vision of what came to be called the ghost dance. And in this vision that he believed came to him from his ancestral spirits, the vision was of a dance that Native Americans could perform in certain ways, that if they performed them, and you saw a clip of that earlier at the very beginning of this lecture, what it looked like in that second film clip. And the idea was that if you performed this dance in a ritualistic way, sometimes this involved the taking of peyote and other psychedelic psychedelic substances. But mostly it was this dance that one would perform, chanting certain things. And this would do, according to Wovoka, was it would do, well, basically it would do two things. One, it would bring back all of the ancestors to life that had been killed by the white man over the prior 50 or 60 years of white encroachment onto the trans-Mississippi West. In addition to that, if you did this dance, the Native Americans believed, it would give you immunity from the white man's bullets and the white man's violence. Now, obviously, one can see, and many Native Americans came to follow Wovoka's idea, but it was an act of desperation, as we can see. It was a sense that things had gotten so out of control that this magical idea permeated many Indian cultures. What's also interesting to note is it became a pan-Indian phenomenon. In other words, until the arrival of the white man, most Native Americans saw themselves as members of their own tribe. They didn't relate to members of other tribes. I mean, they might trade with them and so forth, but they did not see themselves as one people. But by 1890, when the ghost dance begins to take off across the American West and is taken up by all kinds of different tribes across the American West, from the Paiute in Nevada in the west to the Sioux in the east, on the Great Plains and in the Dakotas, it becomes this mass cultural phenomena that the Native Americans adopt across cultural lines, and we sort of see the beginnings of the adoption of a pan-Indian identity that is now part of American Indian life, seeing themselves as a distinct ethnic group as well as being members of whatever tribe they happen to belong to. So anyways, the ghost dance catches on. And it spreads, as we said, all across the Great Plains in the West, and it even spreads to the Sioux, the large Sioux reservations in South Dakota, and just become a state in 1889. Now, the ghost dance, while most white people and the white military officials laughed at the very idea of the ghost dance as being actually able to give the Native Americans immunity. What many white officers in the military and many white officials in the government were fearful of was that it would cause the Indians to resist life on the reservation, to rise up against white authorities and to challenge them. And so the government and the military made it part of their policy to suppress the ghost dance wherever they saw it performed. And of course, the place where this violence against practitioners of the ghost dance reached its peak was at the Wounded Knee Reservation in South Dakota on December 29th, 1890, when troops basically when Native Americans were told to stop doing the ghost dance and continue to do the ghost dance, the troops, the U.S. troops that were there were stationed at the reservation to keep the Indians pacified and under control. Sort of surrounded the ghost dancers, and nobody's exactly sure who fired the first shot, but the troops obviously panicked or simply didn't care and opened fire on the various on these hundreds and hundreds of people who were performing the ghost dancing, murdering several hundred of them. It would become the last great massacre of the 19th century of Native Americans, and from that point on, Native American life became much more controlled by the white government and the white military. There was no more armed resistance to white control. And of course, Black Elk, whose memoirs are one of the great pieces of autobiographical writing in American history. Black Elk was a member of the Sioux people. "I did not know then," he wrote, "how much was ended. When I look back now from this high hill of my old age, I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the crooked gulch, as plain as when I saw them with eyes still young." What he's noting here, of course, is that the massacre was not just of warriors and young men who might threaten the troops, it was of everybody. This was typical of Army responses to any kind of Native American resistance, was to simply massacre everybody that was there, including women and children. "And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream." And so what Black Elk is sort of noting is that the age of the independent Indian, living on the Great Plains in the ways of his ancestors, connected to the land spiritually, hunting the bison across the open prairies, that had come to an end, and that a new chapter in American Indian life was opening, and a much more dismal and depressing chapter in which they would be forced to live on reservations. They would be forced to engage in ways of life like subsistence farming that was not part of their cultural heritage, that their children would be indoctrinated into the white man's ways and would lose the old Indian customs. Now, and in fact, to some extent, Black Elk's sad prediction of the future did come true. For the next 50 years, the Dawes Act was used to basically divide up the tribes. All authority was taken away from the tribes and given to agents of the U.S. government. Indians had almost no say over their own lives. Things began to change a little bit in the 1930s during the New Deal era of Franklin Roosevelt, when the government, Franklin Roosevelt signed and the Congress passed what was called the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which basically ended the Dawes Act and said, tribal organizations and reservations can remain communally held by Native Americans. They tried to restore some of the authority of tribal governments over their own people, to, in other words, give the Indian a certain degree of sovereignty over his own land. And so there began to be a push back against the policies of the 19th century of either eliminating the Indian altogether, of destroying the Indian culture. There was beginning to be a pushback. Then in the 1960s, you had the rise of a civil rights movement among Native Americans. It was called the American Indian Movement. We spoke about it earlier on in the week. And this was a radical organization primarily of young Native Americans who were kind of resisting some of their elders and their parents' practices of sort of following the white man's lead and trying to because many of them had absorbed the idea of assimilation as the way forward for Native Americans. And the American Indian Movement was basically, had a several-prong agenda. One, of course, was to wrest more control away from the federal government and give it to Native Americans, particularly control over matters of, for example, criminal justice, so that when there were crimes that occurred on the Indian reservations, that Native American courts would be able to handle them, that more decision-making would be given to Native Americans. But it was also a cultural movement to sort of revive old Indian values and old cultural values that had been neglected and forgotten over the decades, as an earlier generation of Indians had sort of tried to find a way to live with the white man by absorbing the white man's ways and assimilating themselves into the white man's culture. The American Indian Movement said to be proud of Native American culture and to become, to resurrect it and to follow it. At that same Wounded Knee Reservation in South Dakota, for example, in 1973, there was this had to do with criminal justice. There was a crime committed on the reservation. The FBI moved in to prosecute, to capture and prosecute those the people allegedly guilty of committing. There was a couple of murders, and the Indians, basically under the American Indian Movement and others, resisted the FBI, and there was a long standoff with the FBI at the Wounded Knee Reservation in 1973. It went on for months and months and months, and ultimately the young Native Americans, the young Sioux people on the Wounded Knee Reservation, were able to get the government to back off, to allow Indian authorities to take care of their own criminal justice issues. And this was a major step forward for Native Americans in terms of reasserting control over their own lives and their own lands. Equally significant is what happened in 1987, on the 100th anniversary of the Dawes Act. In 1987, the Supreme Court made a decision. Basically, we should go into a little bit of the background of that decision. So, we all understand that the question of sovereignty, right? That who has sovereignty, who has power, who has control over Indian lands, who has ultimate authority over Indian lands. And so what happened was, in the 1980s, the Pechanga band, not the Pechanga band, but the Cabazon band of Mission Indians who live out near Palm Springs, decided they wanted a source of cash, and they decided they were going to open a casino. Now, of course, at the time, under California law, casino gambling is illegal. And so the Cabazon Band of Indians decided to challenge this idea. They basically said that we have sovereignty over this land, and we are going to make decisions for our people, and we have control over the lands that are on this reservation. The state of California does not. I mean, the state of California has certain authority in the reservations. For example, California laws against murder and robbery and all those sort of things. Of course, they apply on the casino. They would would apply on the reservation. They would have to, otherwise you would have chaos and anarchy. But the idea was that in certain areas that were not of prime interest to the state of California, the Indians should have control. And what the Cabazon Band of Indians argued in their legal case was that the government of California had no compelling reason to ban casino gambling on the reservations, and that casino gambling was something that the Indians could decide on their own. The case wound its way up. It was obviously it involved critical constitutional issues. It was taken up by the Supreme Court in 1987, and it ruled in its Cabazon Band of Mission Indians versus California that in fact the Cabazon Band of Indians was right, that the state of California had no compelling interest in banning casino gambling, and that element of sovereignty, the decision to either have casino gambling or not have casino gambling, was really a sovereignty held by the Indian tribe itself. And so of course they open up their first casino, and of course that opens the floodgates, because if it applies to the Cabazon Band of Native Americans, it's going to apply to all Indians across the country. And we see over the course of the last 30 years now, the explosion of casino gambling throughout the United States on Indian reservations. And this casino gambling has been a boon for many Native American tribes. Not all. It's particularly benefited those Native American tribes, like the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, who happen to be near major urban centers or happen to be in resort areas where there are lots of potential customers for their casinos. Other groups have been less able to cash in on this casino largesse. For example, the Sioux are out far away from any urban areas in the open spaces of North and South of South Dakota, and so have less ability to exploit this part of their sovereignty. But it has helped a number of Native American tribes gain back not only sovereignty over themselves, but also has given them the resources to provide decent education, cultural activities, housing, medicine, all kinds of things that Indians on the reservations have always lacked. Native American peoples are perhaps the most of all American groups are the most likely to suffer from poverty and from want of social services. But there's also I see a great irony in this. The white man comes to the United States, comes to America, and begins to move into the various Indian lands. And of course, what happens is the white man begins to take away what matters most to the Native Americans. He takes away their land, the thing that they are spiritually connected to, as well as economically dependent upon. This was, as we talked about earlier in the week, land had a spiritual significance to the Indian that many white people could not understand. And so it was a great tragedy. That the most important thing that mattered to the Native Americans was exactly what the white man was taking away from them. With the Cabazon Band of Indians versus California and the growth of casino gambling, I always think it's kind of ironic that now the Indian is taking away what matters most to the white man, and that, of course, is his money. So what goes around comes around, as they say. In the wake of the displacement of the Native American people from most of the land of the Trans-Mississippi West and the expropriation of that land, came the economic exploitation of the West. Now, some of this exploitation came in the form of small, individual farmers who were given. We talked about the Homestead Act of 1862, passed by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, which allowed people to take 160 acres so long as they lived on it and improved it as farmland. And millions of Americans took up this offer and began to settle in the West. This included not just whites, but it also included a number of African Americans from the South who were fleeing the racism and growing segregation of the South to settle on lands of the West. In 1879, for example, there was a mass movement of Native Americans out of the South towards Oklahoma and Kansas, known as the Exoduster movement, as in Exodus from the biblical story of the Jews fleeing slavery and bondage in Egypt. But a lot of what happened in the West, of course, was development by big corporations that were rising into power, as we talked about last week in America, particularly the railroads. And as we talked about, railroads were given vast land grants of land that they could use as collateral to obtain capital to build the railroads. And it was also a major source of wealth for those who owned shares in railroad companies and the leadership of the railroad companies. And of course, railroads advertised extensively, both in the eastern states and in Europe, to potential immigrants, that there was lands available that the railroad could sell to them. And so a lot of the lands of the West were developed by big businesses. For example, they came to dominate the American economy in the late 19th century, and they came to dominate the economy of the West. Speculators and big businesses oftentimes took advantage of homesteading claims by buying them up. There were also the U.S. government passed a law in 1872 that basically opened up mineral resources at bargain basement prices to anybody who could exploit them. And of course, this was not like gold, panning for gold in California during the gold rush. The only way to be able to access these minerals, copper, tin, lead, other key mineral resources, was with huge amounts of capital that big business had. And so the U.S. government saw all of this land that it had taken from the Indians as something that it needed to hand over to people to develop. Private industry, private individuals to develop. Now, some of this, as we said, went to homesteaders, but a lot of it went to big business. Nowhere was that more the case than in California, where many of the lands of central and southern California were expropriated from the Californios. Now, the Californios were the Mexican Americans who lived in California prior to the Mexican-American War of 1848, and they had developed large ranches and in some cases farms where they practice a traditional sort of Mexican lifestyle. But when whites move into California, they begin to expropriate the land. The problem was that many Californians did not have deeds to the land. The Mexican government was not as effective in making a paper trail for land ownership and deeds of property. And so whites came in and began to, using lawyers and legal methods, began to challenge California ownership of the land. And so much of the large land holdings that these California families had ended up being taken away from them in courts and through legal processes and turned over to large Anglo-American farmers and corporations. Many of the names around Los Angeles, places like La Cienega, Sepulveda, and others, refer to these old California families and ranches that were expropriated by large Anglo-American farming and ranching interests. As I mentioned before, the West was also a destination for many African Americans after the Civil War. On the left, you see a guy named Nat Love. He was a famous cowboy performer. He had actually originally been a cowboy and then became a performer in those various Wild West shows that I had mentioned earlier. And as I think we talked about before, many of the cowboys in the Old West were in fact African American. About 25% of the cowboys on the Texas Cattle Drive, made famous in dime novels from the 19th century and movies of the 20th century, westerns of the 20th century, were in fact African American. There was also, as I said, that Exoduster movement, a movement of of African Americans out of the South to homestead lands in Kansas and Oklahoma. And many of those homesteads, African American homesteads still exist. From across the Pacific, of course, came Chinese Americans. They came from a variety of all immigration as we're going to talk about next week, is a matter of push and pull factors. There are things that are pushing people out of their native lands and things that are pulling them into the lands that they want to move to. And most of the Chinese immigrants who came to the United States, I mean, we know, of course, many of them came for the gold rush to make their fortunes in the gold mines. But there was also push factors. Many of these migrants, these early Chinese immigrants, came from southeastern China, the area around Hong Kong and Guangzhou province. And this, of course, has traditionally been where a lot of Chinese immigrants have left from. Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, for example, many of them, and the Philippines and other places like that, are populated by Chinese from this region of China. It is the most commercialized region. It's the region of China most exposed to the outside world. And it was also, in the middle of the 19th century, the part of China that was most undergoing commercial change. There was mass disruption of peasant farming practices as land was consolidated by landlords and turned into commercial farms. So we're going to talk about next week when we talk about immigration generally. A big factor in emigration, people leaving their homelands, is not necessarily just poverty per se, but it's also economic change, where people are becoming redundant and obsolete in their native lands, where there's no real place for them in the changing economy, and so in desperation they flee those lands for new ones, and that of course explains some of the Chinese immigration that was going on from southeastern China, from the area from what's now Guangzhou province. Another factor, of course, in emigration is war and civil unrest. And of course, China was torn by unrest in the 1850s and 60s in a rebellion known as the Taiping Rebellion, which there's a lot of complicated factors behind it, but it basically was a civil war in China. In fact, it was the bloodiest war of the 19th century. Far more people died in it than died in the American Civil War. And it basically was connected sort of the gradual modernization of China, and it was a revolt against the Qing dynasty, and the Qing dynasty tried to suppress these rebels in the southeast, and it sent thousands upon thousands of Chinese people abroad. Many of the Chinese we talked about before came as individuals to engage in gold mining, but once the gold rush was over, more and more of the Chinese were brought over as contract laborers by people like this, the Tongs or known as the Six Companies of San Francisco. These were labor contractors and middlemen who had connections back in China with various village and government authorities, and they would commission for contract laborers to be brought over, and then the Tongs would take a cut of their wages to pay for their passage across the Pacific, and many of these Chinese contract laborers were put to work, of course, building the Transcontinental Railroad. Many of them worked in the growing mining industry of the American West. Here, of course, is a scene of a number of Chinese workers working on the Transcontinental Railroad as it makes its way across the Sierra Nevada mountains. But the presence of Chinese Americans triggered an anti-Chinese response among many white workers and white residents of California, including this guy, Dennis Kearney, who was founder of the California Working Men's Party, which made it its mission to try to restrict Chinese immigration, and in fact succeeded in 1883. We can see some of the hostility of the Chinese in these very racist cartoons and political pamphlets from the 1870s and 80s, where the Chinese are depicted as taking away the white man's jobs, and the slogan of the California Working Men's Party was "The Chinese must go." The Chinese were depicted as people who were willing to work for wages that no white man would accept, that they lived more like savages, and therefore they didn't have to pay them as much. And so a lot of the hostility that many white workers had towards their bosses and towards the big corporations that were in control of the California economy, they turned towards the Chinese because they saw the Chinese as depressing wages. And so there was a mass movement in California among many white workers to ban Chinese immigration, and in fact they succeeded in 1883 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first first Immigration Exclusion Act in American history. It was aimed at the Chinese, and it predated broader restrictions on immigration that we're going to talk about next week that occurred in 1924 that banned a lot of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. But the very first group to be excluded from immigration, and it was an absolute and total ban, was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1883. Again, not surprisingly, given the American history of American tradition of racism, that the very first group to be excluded from the United States would be a non-white group. And finally, I would like to conclude with a return to the year 1890 and to this guy, Frederick Jackson Turner. In 1890, the year of the Wounded Knee Massacre and the end of Indian resistance of any kind to white authority and governmental authority over the Trans-Mississippi West, a kind of a final defeat of American Indian resistance until really until the revival of that resistance in the American Indian movement of the 1960s. In that same year that occurred, also occurred another important event. In 1890, the U.S. Census, every 10 years the United States conducts a census. And throughout the 19th century, the American census, the U.S. Census, the decennial U.S. Census, had a feature that no longer is in the census for obvious reasons, as you'll see. And that was, in the census, they would include a map. And the map would show a frontier line. And it was basically marking the frontier between what 19th century white Americans saw as civilization and savagery, and that was the frontier line. In 1890, when the census came out, the people who wrote up the census declared that, in fact, there was no more frontier, that the West had effectively been settled. There were still pockets of open territory, but for all intents and purposes, a specific frontier line between white American civilization and Native American savagery, as white Americans saw it in the 19th century, was over. Then, a few years later, Frederick Jackson Turner, who was a prominent historian, American historian of the day, gave a speech at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The Columbian Exposition of 1893 was this huge World's Fair held in Chicago to mark, a little bit late, they didn't quite get it finished in time, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World, in the Americas. And among the other things, along with the exhibits and the rides and other fun things that the fair had, they also had a series. The fair was also intended, also had an educational component. There were a number of lectures by different scholars and that sort of thing. The most memorable of these lectures was the one given by Turner here. And in it, he basically argued that the American frontier, the West, had shaped the American character. It had given the American, as we've talked about before, we've been talking about the mythology of the West, his and her identity of rugged individualism, of expansionism, always this new place to conquer and to subdue. And that had been part of the American character for so long. It had shaped our institutions. It had laid the basis for our individualistic democracy that we have. The idea that people created their own governments, as many white settlers had to do in the West, that this urge to conquer and subdue territory was what made American society and American culture so dynamic and so powerful and so successful. And what Frederick Jackson Turner was asking when he looked at the census of 1890 and said, the frontier is gone, what does this mean for America's future? Where do we go next? What is the next frontier? And in fact, Turner would spark, along with other thinkers and other ideas going on in the 1890s, this idea that America needed a new frontier to subdue, a new place for American energy to express itself. And what we'll see in a couple of weeks is one of the places where this energy would be redirected was toward an imperialist mission to conquer new territories beyond American shores. And in fact, we see in the late 1890s, throughout the 1890s, the acquisition of territories beyond American shores, places like Hawaii, and then of course in the Spanish-American War, places like the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Guam and other possessions. And so this idea of the frontier ending in 1890 leads to, in part, it's part of the cause for this imperialist expansion, which is something we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, next week we will be talking about immigration. We talked about Chinese immigration a little bit this time, but we're going to get into it in a much deeper way with the mass immigration of Southern and Eastern Europeans into America between the 1870s and the 1920s. We'll see you next week.